On the 16th of December 1944, the quiet Ardennes region of Belgium erupted to the sound of battle. Over the front line poured 250,000 German troops, backed up by hundreds of tanks and armoured vehicles. The fire from 2,000 artillery pieces supported their ferocious attack. This attack came as a complete surprise to the Allies, and in the first few days, it almost succeeded. Once the Allies gathered themselves together, the German offensive was doomed to fail. Shortages in fuel, difficult terrain, and supply problems would help ensure the collapse of the last great German offensive operation in the West. The fact that this mighty force had been assembled in secrecy left the Allies with a few embarrassing questions to answer and showed that, even as the Allied offense gathered pace, the ultimate defeat of Hitler would not be an easy task. Since the 6th of June 1944, when the Allies had gained a foothold in Normandy, they had pushed ever-increasing numbers of men and material through the beachhead. However, the closer the Allies got to the German border, the stiffer German resistance became, as the Allies fought intense and costly battles in the areas around Aachen and the Ardennes Forest. Soon, the two main Allied lines of advance were moving in different directions. In between them lay the Ardennes region. The Allied troops involved in the recent battles at Aachen and the Ardennes Forest were sent to this quiet sector to rest and refit. Allied confidence was high, and there were even hopes that the war was drawing to an end.
After the fighting in Normandy in the summer of 1944, the Allies had really made spectacular progress. Although it had taken them 7 or 8 weeks to commence the breakout from the Normandy bridgehead, the next fortnight or so saw them travel virtually all the way to the German border. In the process, the German armed forces in Western Europe were largely destroyed, really no more than scattered remnants by early September.
The British were in Brussels by September the 3rd, liberated Brussels, and then September the 4th they took Antwerp. And it was at that point that the British suffered a logistic crisis and the advance ground to a halt. Now, at exactly the same time, the Americans had been advancing, but on a divergent axis, to the south. Patton's Third Army was on the Meuse by the 1st of September 1944, but then he too suffered a logistic crisis.
Hitler did not want to relinquish the initiative to the Allies. He had to pull something out of this debacle, and as early as August 1944, he began to lay plans for a counterstroke. Hitler felt that a well-executed offensive in the West at this stage could cause the Allies to rethink their position.
So Hitler is going to attack through the Ardennes, the scene of the great German victory of 1940 against the French. He's going to attack through the Ardennes, recreate the victory of 1940, and go on and split the Allies.
By bringing upon them this surprise defeat, he hoped that politically that would be the end of the alliance. They would sue for peace, and he could then turn to the Russians, knowing that he was only fighting a war on one front.
General Alfred Jodl identified the main problems that had to be overcome as the Allied air superiority, supply difficulties, and the need for secrecy. To counter the Allied air power, the date for the offensive was planned for late November and then moved to mid-December. It was reasoned that the bad weather usually prevalent at this time would severely restrict the overwhelming air power of the Allies. The question of secrecy was the most critical aspect of the assault. Access to the plans was restricted to a few choice commanders, and informing the troops of the plans was left to the last possible moment. Alongside this, a deception plan was put in place that would, hopefully, fool the Allied intelligence services. Firstly, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, noted for his capabilities in defense, was recalled from retirement and placed in the position of Commander-in-Chief of the German forces in the West. To the outside world, he replaced the more aggressive Field Marshal Model, but Model continued to work on plans for the attack.
Gerd von Rundstedt was brought in on 1st of September 1944 to act purely as a figurehead, to lull the Allies into a sense of security, to believe that this old man of 69 couldn't possibly be involved in a major offensive. Von Rundstedt was known to be a solid defensive general.
The Germans conducted deliberate deception. They had, for instance, 6th Panzer Army expose itself to Allied aerial reconnaissance in the area of Cologne, and then, once they knew that the Allies had pictures of 6th Army in Cologne, they moved it by night to its new jumping-off place for the attack.
The plan itself looked flawless on paper. Hitler planned to push a strong armoured lead force down the Armblie Valley, through the Allied-held positions and on to Antwerp. By doing this, he hoped to split the Allied front in two.
Antwerp was one of the major ports that the Allies were using to bring supplies in to northwest Europe. Supplies were a big problem for the Germans, fighting on two fronts as they were. So the idea was that if Hitler could cut the Allies off from one of the main sources of supply that kept their armies going, then perhaps he could fight the Western Allies on more of a one-to-one basis.
It was envisaged that these developments would show the Allies that Germany could snatch victory from the jaws of defeat.
They got this operation, and Hitler titled it, the whole offensive was called Wacht am Rhine, which was watch over the Rhine. So if the Allies were to get note of, or get information regarding this operation, this offensive, they would simply believe it was a defensive operation, moving troops about the border to try and prevent the Allies moving into Germany.
If the plan looked good on paper, the reality was that it was far from flawless. The Ardennes of 1944 contained a very different enemy to that of 1940. The combined Allied forces that were situated in or around this area had been fighting the Germans for over 5 years in many different theatres. They had the confidence of a near inexhaustible store of supplies, and whereas Hitler had to scrape the barrel to assemble the forces necessary for the attack, the Allies could rapidly deploy forces to the Ardennes. In 1940, speed of advance was needed for this type of plan to work. In 1940, the route used had travelled in a southwesterly direction and had made good use of the available roads. This time, the direction of the attack was northwesterly, and only a few roads were open. The Americans stemmed the flow of traffic by closing key roads, either temporarily or permanently. This caused traffic build-ups and slowed down the advance of the vital armoured units.
In addition, the Germans' resources were really inadequate to the task. Although some of the forces used by the Germans were very good and were very well equipped, there were an awful lot of second-rate personnel. There was also a deficiency in artillery, in ammunition, in fuel.
And the lead elements of this offensive are told that they have to capture their own supplies as they advance. So here we have an offensive which depends on the ability of the spearheads to actually capture their own fuel as they advance.
These detours to find the lifeblood of the panzers would help to slow the advance. These delays would not leave much of a time window for the troops to reach their objectives.
The weather was always going to be a problem. Hitler chose the winter months deliberately because that was a time when the Allied air forces would be grounded by the weather. Perhaps what he didn't consider also was the fact that that weather was going to affect the movement of his troops. At that time of year you could expect snow, and for a heavy 68-ton Tiger tank to try and move in that weather was absolutely appalling.
When any competent German general who had actually worked with troops in the field saw this plan, their instant response was, nope, this is not going to work. The only German generals who accepted this plan were people like Jodl, who were yes men. Hitler surrounded himself with yes men, and his yes men saw this plan and said, yes, that'll work. Everybody else said that this plan was not going to work.
It's worth quoting an excerpt from SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich's interrogation after the war, as it gives a good indication of the feelings of the generals at the time. He said, "All I had to do was cross the Meuse River, capture Brussels, and then go on and take the port of Antwerp. All of this in December, January and February, the worst 3 months of the year, through the Ardennes, where the snow was waist deep and where there wasn't room to deploy 4 tanks abreast, let alone 6 armoured divisions."
Although Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander of German forces in the West, and Field Marshal Model, the commander of Army Group B that launched the Ardennes offensive, disagreed about many things, about one thing they absolutely did agree, which was that Hitler's plan for an armoured thrust towards Antwerp was virtually impossible. Both of them believed that the Germans should have a much more limited objective, an encirclement still, but an encirclement not of all of the British and Canadian forces in northwest Europe, but simply of the US First Army, which was deployed north of the Ardennes sector. They believed that if the Germans tried to do this, and that they probably could do this, they could have beneficial results.
Hitler's last gamble was now underway, but the desperate nature of the situation was already clear to see. On paper, the Germans had gathered together a strong attacking force spread across 3 armies. The 6th Panzer Army under Dietrich had the northernmost advance route. They were to advance from their forming up areas near Dahlem in Germany and into Belgium around the town of Losheim. Their objective was to cross the Meuse River just below Liège and advance into Antwerp. Alongside the 6th Panzer Army was the 5th Panzer Army under the command of Lieutenant General Hasso von Manteuffel. Their objective was to move from Prüm in Germany and on to Antwerp via Brussels. The 7th Army, under General Erich Brandenberger, had the southernmost route into Luxembourg. This infantry-only formation were to move from Bitburg in Germany and engage the US 3rd Army, with the objective of tying down these forces. All of these forces were part of Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Model. It totaled over 250,000 men and almost 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. It was to cause the Allies grave concern in the days to come.
The German forces that were used to spearhead the Ardennes offensive were of very varied quality. Although the SS and other panzer divisions that were used contained a cadre of experienced personnel, very large numbers of the personnel in those divisions were ex-Air Force or ex-Navy personnel.
So basically Hitler moved sailors into infantry divisions, he moved Air Force personnel into parachute divisions, and he formed a number of Volksgrenadier divisions, people that had been in other jobs elsewhere, or they were young men or older men.
The Germans were able to concentrate their combat power for the Ardennes offensive by moving their units as though they were preparing for an Allied offensive, as though they were preparing a counterstroke. So when the Allied the Allied intelligence analysts saw a movement of German forces. Their preconceived notions were that the Germans are already beaten, that all they're doing is acting defensively, and therefore, when they saw an elite German unit being brought back up to strength and being moved to face the Western Allies in France, they assumed that it was just preparation for the inevitable Allied attacks across the River Rhine.
Facing this imposing lineup was a variety of American units. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions were part of the US 5 Corps under Major General Gerow. They were positioned opposite the 6th Panzer Army. Facing Manteuffel in the center were the 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, who were part of Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps. In the south, facing Brandenberger's men, were troops from the 9th Armored and the 4th Infantry Divisions. Most of these American units had recently been involved in heavy fighting and were in the area for a rest. These combined units totaled around 83,000 men, backed up with around 450 tanks and assault guns and around 400 artillery pieces. They were in a strange country at a bleak time of year, and many of them were thinking of home and Christmas. Most of them had already suffered at the hands of the enemy, and the last thing they wanted or needed was to be the subject of an attack of this scale or intensity.
The Ardennes sector was being held by very weak American divisions. One was totally inexperienced, the 106th, never been in battle before, and the other two, the 28th Infantry Division and the 4th Infantry Division, had been knocked about up in the Ardennes Forest. And then you got the 9th Armoured Division in reserve, which again was not experienced, and a cavalry group that was in that area. But they were very thinly spread.
However, unlike the Germans, they had many factors in their favor. Although initially outnumbered, the Allies had strong forces close by that could be called upon if needed. These included the battle-tested Third Army under the command of General George Patton. At this stage, the Allied supply lines had been established, and when the weather permitted, they had complete domination of the sky. They just needed to delay the Germans in the initial stages and be patient until the odds swung in their favor. One other significant danger for the Germans was the Allied ability to feed in extra reserves from both the north and south. To counter this, an attack by the 12th SS Panzer Corps was planned to coincide with the assault. But strong rumblings from the Eastern Front led to the cancellation of this operation. In consequence, the flanks of the German armies in the north would be at the mercy of British reinforcements under Field Marshal Montgomery.
I think the morale and mood of the Allied forces in northwest Europe in Christmas 1944 or so was really one of grim determination. Quite clearly, the elation and the optimism of summer 1944, following the breakout from Normandy, when lots of people thought that the war would be over within a couple of weeks, even perhaps, or certainly just a few months, had disappeared.
As the weather got worse, as the rain sleeted down, a sense of ennui begins to grip many Allied soldiers. It affected the Americans particularly, not quite so much the British, because one must remember that Britain, and particularly London, was still being hit by V1s and V2s. And so this was a fairly powerful motivation for the British to press on and at least try and do as much damage as they possibly could to the Germans. But for a lot of the Americans, some of them had been away from the United States for more than 2 years. And this is, their second, perhaps their third Christmas away from the folks at home. And there's a real homesickness amongst some of them.
At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of the 16th of December, the German artillery opened fire along the front line, which was approximately 85 miles long. This intensive barrage lasted less than an hour, and was mainly designed to confuse the enemy and to disrupt their lines of communication. It was hoped that it would also open gaps in the lines. The Germans did make significant gains, breaking through and infiltrating some areas. The now isolated Allied groups were overrun and either killed or taken prisoner. Some groups resisted, but it was not enough to stem the avalanche of German troops. Further back in the Allied command positions and headquarters, various commanders tried to gain an accurate picture of events, but this proved impossible due to the severing of the lines of communication and the steady capture of the forward positions. It was several days before the US troops began to surrender, but when they did, so many of them surrendered that it still holds the embarrassing record of the biggest surrender of American soldiers in the history of her armed forces. Crucially, however, the US troops held on to places of strategic importance: the Elsenborn Ridge in the north, St. Vith in the centre, and Bastogne in the south.
The German attack was based on the idea that 6th Panzer Army, weighted as it was with lots of well-provisioned and well-trained Waffen-SS, were going to be able to hit the Americans. The Americans would disintegrate, and the Germans could then just drive right on through across the Elsenborn Ridge and drive to the River Meuse. That didn't happen.
What developed from here on was a race to the primary objectives. The Germans knew that time was not on their side, and they must reach the targets quickly. From the outset, however, things began to go wrong for the German forces. In the north, the planned parachute drop around Elsenborn Ridge was made in strong winds and appalling weather.
The Germans had to capture the Elsenborn Ridge very early on. Their ability to actually drive north and to reach the Meuse depended on securing this ridge. And this was the role of an airborne operation. And this was an utter and complete failure.
The German paras were under the command of the experienced leader, Colonel von der Heydter. They were dropped over a wide area and were unable to concentrate their efforts. Also, due to the lack of reconnaissance beforehand, they found that they had dropped into the positions of the US 1st Infantry, and that the Americans were stronger than had been anticipated. After realizing that they could not meet their objectives, they tried to break through the American lines in force. After suffering crippling losses, the German paras retreated and then filtered through the American positions in small groups. This unit had started with 1,200 men, although less than 350 managed to fight together due to the dispersal. Less than 100 survivors made it back to their own lines, and von der Heydter was himself captured. The one success of this small but vital mission was in giving the Allies the impression they were fighting a far higher number of troops, and consequently, they then committed large numbers of their own men to counter the supposed threat. If the advance of the 1st SS Panzer Corps had been more rapid, they could have taken advantage of this development. As it was, they had run into difficulties of their own. The newly arrived US 99th Division had defended itself well into the opening stages of the attack. The vital high ground remained in American hands. The lead force of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Kampfgruppe Peiper, continued the moves to the west towards Honsfeld.
The unit which has to succeed for 6th SS Panzer Army to succeed is a Kampfgruppe under the commander Joachim Peiper. And this unit has just 48 hours to get from its start line and reach the Meuse. And very, very quickly, it begins falling behind schedule. Piper is used to operating in the conditions of the Eastern Front, wide plains, rolling hills. And when Piper constructs his march formation, what he does is, quite sensibly, places heavy vehicles, his Panzerkampfwagen, Mark 6s, the Tigers, and indeed the King Tigers, at the head of the columns. But what he doesn't calculate on is the fact that the low top speed of the Tiger will actually slow down the entire column.
He was going through little roads over little bridges with these huge tanks, some of which were 68 tons. And as he progressed, small pockets of American resistance actually were thrown in front of him and actually made him divert his route. He had to take several diversions. Hence, Piper had to start moving into territory that belonged to the central thrust.
South of these actions, the 5th Panzer Army got off to a better start. Their advance was made against the thinly spread American 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, who were not prepared for battle at this stage. The Germans pushed through these groups with ease. However, some of the American forces slowed the advance and managed to hold a number of the bridges in the area. At the end of the first day, Manteuffel's men did force crossing over the Aue River, and they wasted no time in pressing on towards Clairvaux. The third thrust of the attack, Brandenberger's 7th Army, positioned further south, got off to a very poor start due to difficult terrain and determined American defenders of the US 109th Regiment.
This American resistance and a combination of logistics and other flaws on the Germans' part, for example the fact that the initial attacks went in under strength, meant that the Germans' effort was really falling apart very, very quickly.
Overall, although difficulties had been encountered, the 17th of December saw the all-important German army committed in strength. However, the American High Command was already beginning to move reinforcements to the area. Among these reinforcements were the 7th and 10th Armoured Divisions, together with the 101st Airborne Division. This latter unit was ordered to the town of Bastogne, which occupied the most important road junction in the whole region. It was now a race against time. In the north, the Germans continued in their efforts to reach the given targets. The commander of the 1st SS Corps was becoming frustrated at the slow pace of the advance. He moved the 12th SS Panzer Division, which was engaged in fighting around the Elsenborn Ridge, and pushed them in behind the 1st SS Panzer Division, who were moving towards the Amblive River. This was one of the first major mistakes made during the offensive, as it only succeeded in helping to relieve the pressure on the Americans, who were defending the area. The Americans lost no time in turning this development to their advantage. They strengthened their positions to such an extent that the Germans found it impossible to take the area.
Little American organizations like infantry platoons were holding out on these narrow mountain roads in the Ardennes region, and even though they themselves were not in contact with any higher authority, nobody was ordering them to do what they were doing, they managed to conduct a defense in depth. And this is very important. The only way you can stop a German armored attack is by defense in depth. That means you don't try to hold some kind of line of defense. You hold strong points, and you make the Germans fight for strong points. And if they bypass you, then you can counterattack. The Americans hadn't planned this kind of defense. It's just the way it worked out.
As the 1st SS Division's advance continued, Kampfgruppe Piper became involved in a small firefight near Baugnières. What followed has been the subject of many debates. What cannot be denied is that around 80 American prisoners of war were shot dead. The Americans claimed that this was in cold blood. The Germans claimed they were trying to escape.
On the 17th of December, an American patrol came out and they discovered that the bodies of these American soldiers lying in the snow, clearly the result of massacre. So here were the Germans, particularly the Waffen-SS, bringing the standards of war which had become common on the Eastern Front to the Western Front. And very, very quickly, and this always happens with immense rapidity in armies, the word went out. My guess is that within 3 to 4 hours, every American soldier in the Ardennes had heard that the Germans were not taking prisoners. And there are only two things you can do in that situation. One is that you can run, or if you can't run, then you've got to fight. So Kampfgruppe Piper and other elements of the Waffen-SS had inadvertently increased America's fighting power enormously in the Ardennes.
Wasting no time, Kampfgruppe Piper quickly replenished the fuel tanks of the panzers and pushed on towards the town of Stavelot and its vital bridge. Here, however, the advance was held up for a number of hours when they came under attack. Piper, who was unsure of the size of the attacking force, delayed further advances until the following morning. Stavelot was taken during the 18th of December, and the advance continued towards Trois Ponts. Near Trois Ponts were the bridges that crossed the Salm and Almblive rivers. As Piper's men approached, the American defenders blew the bridges to avoid their use by the Germans. The only option left open to Piper was to move his column back. He tried to advance through to Chenot, where another bridge crossed the Almblive, but came under attack from American aircraft. It was at this point that the main advance of the once mighty 1st SS Panzer Division ground to a halt. The last offensive of the war in the west would end for the majority of Piper's men in the small village of L'Église as he ordered his men to set up defenses. The critical fuel factor had played a significant part in the failure of this part of the German advance. By the time his men had reached L'Église and the nearby Stourmont, the fuel tanks of their vehicles had been run almost dry. Much had been expected of the SS forces, and when news of the decision to stay in L'Église reached the German commanders, there was no time to waste. The main emphasis of the offensive was shifted to the 5th Panzer Army's sector. They were making good use of the favorable terrain and the poorly prepared defenders of the US 106th Division.
Now, 5th Panzer Army under Manteuffel, this is the Wehrmacht army, was actually advancing with the grain of the country. It was using the main roads. And so now we have this situation where 5th Panzer Army is actually surging to the west, which is fine, it looks good on a map. The only problem is it's not where the Germans want to go. The Germans want to go north.
They continued in their race to reach the objectives given, one of these being the key town of Bastogne. The town of Bastogne was crucial because 3 roads converged there, making it a local centre of communication. However, they'd been pipped to the post by the US 101st Airborne Division. These seasoned veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden set up all-round defences. When Manteufel's men ran into these positions, they found it impossible to break through. Manteuffel ordered his forces to waste no more time, and they bypassed the town and continued their advance. This created a strong pocket of enemy resistance within the German-held positions. The attempts to eliminate this resistance would soak up considerable amounts of German men and material.
The initial shock that had hit the Americans was over. Eisenhower reacted and within 60 hours had got troops moving in to blunt the offensive, to blunt the Bulge. The northern shoulder and the southern shoulder were pushing in, and the Germans, within a matter of days, really, although the offensive lasted for a month, and within a matter of days it was actually grinding to a halt.
On the 22nd of December, the Germans went to Bastogne carrying a white flag and the offer of surrender for the Americans. The garrison commander, General McAuliffe, gave a simple reply: nuts. At the same time, further north, the Germans had eventually managed to take the town of Saint-Vith. This was particularly important because it was the other key road junction on the Germans' intended route of advance. They'd been bogged down around this town for days, and, as in other areas of the battle, these delays allowed the Americans to build up defenses further back. On Christmas Eve 1944, Manteuffel's forces reached an area just west of Celles. This would become the furthest point reached by the Germans during this offensive. Christmas Day 1944 saw the besieged town of Bastogne coming under increasing pressure from the Germans, but the Allies' massive air superiority meant the garrison could be supplied by air without fear of German intervention. The American defenders prepared to fight to the end. Elements of Patton's forces were moving closer, and on Boxing Day, December the 26th, they managed to force an opening through the German lines and into Bastogne. With this relief action, the German situation became increasingly hopeless.
By the last few days of December 1944, it was clear that the German offensive effort was largely exhausted. They'd used up large quantities of fuel, most of their ammunition reserves, and their spearhead formations had been severely attrited in bitter fighting against American forces. In addition, they had failed to open up by far the most important lines of communication around the Elsenborn Ridge in the north and around Bastogne further to the south. The Americans had really solidified their positions. Although they had opened the line of communication through Saint-Vith, this in itself was simply not enough to allow the Germans to maintain their momentum. Furthermore, the weather was changing very much in the Allies' favour.
During the early days of the Ardennes offensive, the Germans had just the overcast and the snow that they needed to protect them from Allied air. However, starting on the 23rd of December 1944, the weather over the Ardennes becomes cold and clear, and the German protection from Allied fighter bombers and indeed heavy bombers disappears.
The Allied pilots would make their presence known over the battle zone and would help ensure the defeat of the German forces. They would achieve this by using very close air support and interdiction of German movement, especially supply columns, and by an aerial resupply of encircled US units. There now unfolded one of the most extraordinary events of the battle. Another key German unit committed to the offensive was the 150th Panzer Brigade. This force was under the command of Otto Skorzeny, a daring commando leader. For the Ardennes offensive, they were ordered to act deep behind the enemy lines and cause panic and confusion. They also had the tasks of capturing vital river crossings and holding them long enough for the main force to reach them. They would make use of captured American jeeps and trucks together with German tanks adapted to resemble American tank destroyers. A few individuals actually reached the Meuse River, but they did not have adequate support and had to abandon this position. Around the same time, groups of them began to get stopped and arrested by the Americans, who were growing increasingly suspicious. The rumors quickly spread that there were Germans operating behind the lines, posing as friendly forces.
Scozzini's commando is quite profound because it leads to a feeling of something like panic at Eisenhower's headquarters. The news that Scozzini has led commandos through the American lines begins to percolate around the American rear areas. So at one level, Scozzini's commando is not succeeding. At another, it is having a major effect, psychologically destabilizing the Americans, going all the way up to the Supreme Allied Commander.
The psychological effect that this small force had upon the Allies far outweighed their small numbers. No one escaped the paranoia, and even Eisenhower himself was confined to his headquarters for fear of assassination. Back in La Gleize, Piper could see the hopelessness of the situation as his men were being shelled relentlessly by the American artillery and tanks. The American determination to defeat this force resulted in them firing over 58,000 shells into this area during the battle. Piper was used to getting out of sticky situations, as he'd done many times before in Russia and Normandy. He gave the order that the tanks and half-tracks that were still serviceable were to be destroyed to prevent their use by the enemy. They were out of vital fuel and there was no ammunition. He left a handful of his men behind to give the impression that they were still battling, and also to look after around 150 American prisoners they'd captured. He led a force of 800 survivors and made for German-held lines. Their attempts were risky, and more than once they became involved in firefights with American forces that were moving across Piper's escape route. They did eventually reach friendly-held positions a few days later. Piper had started with 5,000 men, and these losses in men and machines would be impossible to replace at this stage of the war. In Manteufel's sector, the Americans slowly widened the corridor into Bastogne. The ferocity of the battles increased in intensity, as this area quickly became the focus of the entire struggle for both sides. The Americans pushed further reinforcements into the Bastogne area, including the 4th Armored Division, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry Divisions. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Americans called the battle, was proving a very hard fight for both sides. As the Allies were able to push more forces into the area, they slowly succeeded in pushing the Germans back. By the 2nd of January 1945, the front line had been reduced by around 15 kilometers. It was also around this time that the British made their presence felt. In the early stages of the offensive, Montgomery had recognized the importance of the River Meuse to the Germans and had placed strong British forces in a defensive position along the northern sector. He was also given command of some of the American forces.
Eisenhower made a decision which politically could have been very, very dangerous. He actually appointed Montgomery as senior commander in the north, and that command actually took on quite a lump of the American army, and politically, from the American point of view, that could have been a bad move. But nevertheless, it was a good decision. Montgomery actually started to tidy up the front.
Although very few British forces were actually involved directly in resisting the German offensive, the British role does warrant a mention. Certainly the allocation of British forces to defend the Meuse river crossings, which was something that the British decided upon within a couple of days of the Ardennes offensive beginning, allowed the Americans to free up forces that could be used to advantage in the battle in the Ardennes itself. In addition, by putting Montgomery in charge of the American and British forces on the northern wing of the German penetration, this created a command and control arrangement that was much better suited to dealing with the German offensive than if the Americans had been in charge across the entire sector.
When he felt the time was right, Montgomery launched a counterattack into the German lines with the objective of linking with the Americans further south. This objective was finally reached on January the 4th at the town of La Roche. This link-up put the River Meuse well and truly out of the reach of the Germans. Although the frontline German commanders and troops could see the hopelessness of the situation, Hitler could not. He ordered the advance to continue and achieve the original objective, but at this stage it was an increasingly difficult task. The Allied fighter-bombers rained their deadly blows down on the Germans, just as they'd done during the Normandy battles. A glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon for the Germans at the start of January, when the Luftwaffe launched their own attacks. They committed around 1,000 planes and flew against Allied targets, including airfields. They managed to destroy around 300 Allied aircraft and damaged 25 Allied airfields. The cost, however, amounted to 100 aircraft and, more importantly, experienced pilots who could be ill-afforded. In total, the Germans lost 170 pilots and 67 were taken prisoner, so the Luftwaffe raid was ultimately a failure. Around the middle of January, some of the German units began to be withdrawn from the front line. These withdrawals included the 1st SS Panzer Division, which had suffered badly during the operation. The remaining German units were placed under even more pressure due to this weakening of their overall forces. By the end of January, the front line was back to where it had been at the start of the German offensive 6 weeks earlier. The cost to both sides was high. The Allies lost around 75,000 men. The German cost stood at around 120,000 casualties and losses of considerable numbers of irreplaceable tanks and other vehicles. Hitler's last throw of the dice had failed.